to let you all know that be sure to pick up the April issue of New Mexico Magazine. I've written an article in there about birds and climate change in New Mexico, along with some other things for beginning birders. And Robert helped quite extensively with helping me put that that article together. So that's the April issue of New Mexico Magazine, coming soon. So my name's Jim O'Donnell and I'm with the Taos Land Trust, and this is part 4 in our 4-part series on an introduction to birding and eBird and other bird issues. This is part of a project that we're doing with Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where we are looking to educate local folks about birds and birding, and to develop new birding groups and monitoring groups that will help us with some bird habitat restoration work we'd like to do on some of our conservation easements. So if any of you are interested in joining us to either be on those monitoring groups or to help mentor some young folks that we're going to be bringing on board, drop your contact information in the chat and direct it towards Maya Anthony, M-A-Y-A, Maya Anthony. She's down there on my screen.
She's waving.
She's waving. Just drop her a note with your contact information, and we'll get back to you probably in March as we start to formalize the next steps of this project. So that's a background. I will drop a couple links about all of this into the chat. And also you can go to the Taos Land Trust webpage to see the previous 3 classes that we've done. They're posted there. You can watch the whole thing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robert. I just ask everybody to mute yourselves and send me questions in the chat. And then we will open it up for discussion and a wider discussion and questions probably in about a half an hour or so. All right. Thank you all for joining.
Okay, let me share my screen. I'm disabled at the moment for screen sharing.
I'm working on that. How's that?
That's good. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out for the 4th time here. It's been a bit of a haul. When I envisioned this web tool, I envisioned something a lot smaller than it turned out to be, but it's been a work of joy, and I've really had a great time putting it together, and I've learned a lot. So I'm happy about that, and I hope that you'll find it useful yourselves. A little bit about today. We're going to talk about bird conservation, and we're going to look at some birding examples within that. Some things about birds that I think you'll find interesting. And then I want to spend some time with questions. I'd like to hear from you about ways that you maybe have been applying things you've learned in the workshop, whatever. And reminding you, you're seeing all this, right? You can see my cursor moving back and forth here. Remind you that there is an email address in the About section, rt@riomburobirds.org. And if you don't have my personal email, you can email me at this address. I'd also like to point out some exercises this time. The exercises for this particular time, I'm going to try to do this so I can keep, there we go. I like to see at least one face while I'm out here. I suggest reviewing the core of the workshops, which are really in the observing section and in the identifying birds section. There's a lot in there. And I think that now that some of you have a little more practical experience with some of the stuff, I think it might make more sense than it might have the first time around. So I'd encourage you to spend some time checking that out. Also, exercise 2 is some ideas about how you can use the web tool to find out about information about a species using the photo bird list and the bird list. So whenever you're trying to use it, you go up to this menu on the left and everything's right there. You can go around there. You can get to the photo bird list or the bird list, and there's some details in there. And then there's also a reviewing of the ways in which you can use the tools that Cornell has put together to find out about birds. How about using All About Birds, using eBird? This is not the part we talked about last week of putting your data up on eBird. This is how information you can get from eBird. And so check that out. Check that out if you're inclined. Okay, so conserving birds. I make some claims here that there's only one web of life, and I'm going to give some data to back that up. That we all share one life support system. And then in times of change, and we are talking about climate change today, but I'm not going to mention climate change too much. I think everybody is bombarded with a lot about climate change. And I want to talk about resiliency as a response to climate change, because the climate changes. And what I claim here is that in times of change, resiliency is a key strength. So we're going to talk about three things, three topics: diversity of species and how that leads to ecological resilience; diversity of habitats, how that leads to ecological resilience; and connectivity across habitats at all scales. So we're going to be talking about connectivity across your backyard fence, and we're going to be talking about connectivity across 15 countries. So species diversity. Now, I think if I say, oops, that's not what I wanted. Where is what I wanted? Here's what I wanted. I think if I say to everyone, all life on Earth is genetically related, everybody will say, yeah, I know that. I get that. I know that we share 99% of our DNA with the chimpanzees and so forth. I get that. But I think that there is real value in having a look at a genetic tree, evolutionary tree, and seeing it. It changes somehow the feeling about it. And that's what I want to do. And so what we know is that we diverged from birds. Our path in the evolutionary chain diverged from birds at about 320 million years ago. And so I want to spend a little time exploring that just for a minute, just to get the flavor of what that means. There's an incredible website. It's called OneZoom, and it's data that's driven from the Open Tree of Life, which is a collaboration of 10 institutions. It's an NSF foundation, and it presents the current state of knowledge about evolution. And so it's a wonderful tree. You can get it in different forms. You can have it be a fern, a traditional tree. I like this fractal tree. It's a little more compact. You can zoom in and out in incredible ways. And we'll see a little bit of that right here. So all of life on Earth is on the same tree. There's only one tree. And now in this second version of this tree, I've done a trace. One trace is from the beginning of life to humans. The red trace goes from the beginning of life to birds. So you'll see we're going right down there. As far as we can see at this scale, we're right together. So we're going to go a long ways together. Right out of the bat, we get to the fundamental basis of life on Earth, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryotes. So don't get freaked out about all the terminology if it's new to you. Bacteria, you know about bacteria. Bacteria, anything that really needs being done in your body, the bacteria is doing it. The eukaryotes are probably the most important advance that ever happened in evolution. I say down here, the eukaryotic cell with its walled nucleus became the fundamental building block of what we primarily perceive as life, that is organisms. I say it's perhaps the single most important event in evolutionary history. That's not just an opinion I have, that's an opinion that a lot of evolutionary biologists have. So from plants to worms to elephants to us, the myriad combinations of eukaryotic cells is what makes life the thing we know it as. So we get down here, there's the eukaryotes, Amorphia, this is amoebas down here, and we're still hooking up with the birds as we're moving down. Here we are moving a little further. We're into the animals and we lose the sponges. They go off on their own path. This is 1 billion years later. I fail to say that this is all happening about 2 billion years ago. And this is 1 billion years later that the sponges are taking off. And then we get down here to something we can start to recognize, the bilaterally symmetrical animals. That's starting to sound like us. And the chordates. And I say we're working up to a backbone. So we're moving along here. And then the next, as we get a little further down the path, a few more million years, we find the vertebrate and the jawed vertebrates. That's certainly us again. And we get down here, lungfishes and tetrapods. And by 320 million years ago, we and the birds both have a modern amniotic egg. And that amniotic is the place where we split. The sauropsids go into the birds, the turtles, crocodilians, the mammals take off, and we diverge at that point 320 million years ago. So the point of this is that 320 million years ago, the bird lineage and our own lineage shared a common ancestor, our great, 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 great grandparent. We are literally cousins. And Dawkins and Wong, in their book, The Ancestor's Tale, estimate this as our 170 million greats grandparent, which would have looked superficially like some sort of lizard. Sometimes it's a little difficult to imagine, well, how was it that we could have had a common ancestor with a bird? We're so different. But the point that you have to, there's an exercise you can do to think about that. You can picture yourself now, picture yourself as a 25-year-old fertile human. Picture a 25-year-old fertile human from 1,000 years ago, and you don't have any difficulty with the idea, yeah, I could have bred with that person 1,000 years ago. You can do that 1,000-year step all the way back, and what will result is you'll get back to this point in which we had a shared ancestor. So if this is new material to you, I can recommend The Ancestor's Tale, Neil Shubin's book, The Year in a Fish. Very interesting reading that can help understanding on that. Somehow, it's important from my point of view, to really have that sense there. It takes us away from the us versus us and them kind of idea. I say in our everyday lives, we humans take all kinds of actions and make all kinds of decisions that affect the lives of birds. Whether consciously or not, how we use the land and how we use resources has a dramatic effect on both species and habitat diversity. And then I go on to say, we are habitually inclined to see ourselves as both apart from and above nature. You often read humans and animals, when in reality, it is humans and other animals, or more directly, animals. So I suggest that understanding our place in that web can help bring consciousness to our actions and to our decisions. So of course, this is not just about humans and birds being cousins. This is about all things being related in that sense that there is no one family or one lineage. They're not more evolved than another. Evolutionary biology does not support that. What it supports is that they are differently evolved. We've all been evolving the same time. If you're a species on the planet Earth and some other species is on the planet Earth, whether it's bacteria, archaea, or a worm, or a bird, or a snake, we all have the same length of evolutionary path. And somewhere in that, I think there's something that can help us in thinking about how to think about conserving species and dealing with change. Let me just give you one other idea I want to talk about briefly was the Keystone Species concept. Some of you are probably familiar with that. You may have a habitat in which you can remove one species or some other species and everything is fine. But if you happen to remove one other species, the whole thing collapses. If you Google that, you can find examples of that. There are examples all over the place. So that brings us back to that idea of the equally evolved, differently evolved idea. We don't know what the keystone species are in the totality of the situation. So let me give you a local birding example. Here is a bird that is quite common during the breeding season at the Rio Fernando wetlands, sorry. And it's a Virginia rail. And I say here that the red-winged blackbird we often think of as kind of iconic for the Rio Fernando, because you're constantly hearing its burrito song. My granddaughter May for that one. But just as iconic but underappreciated is the Virginia rail. It's a secretive bird and you may not see it. You could bird there many, many times and never see it. I've birded there many times and I've never seen it. But I did on an outing actually with the TLT on May 11th of 2019, I did hear it. And just with my cell phone made this recording. It's not a great recording, but you can hear, I'll point to the kiddick, 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 kiddick sound. Here it comes. It's very subtle. You could miss it. It's just kiddick, 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 but very common in the spring. But the reason that I wanted to bring up this species is because it's something that is often not seen. And I say here, we notice the birds and trees and shrubs and maybe the turtles and frogs, but there's a vast understory, an underwater array of species that support life in the wetlands. And this list suggests some of the things. The primary foods during the breeding season are invertebrates, all kinds of insects, beetles, snails, spiders, true bugs, and diptera, those fly larvae. Additionally, it consumes slugs, small fish, caterpillars, flies, earthworms, amphipods, those are small crustaceans, crayfish, frogs, on and on and on and on. So the point of this is to bring us to the idea of species diversity. And we may see that beautiful bird, but there's a whole range of other species that are underpinning the existence of that bird. We might just take a question if there are any here. Or we can zoom on into.
Right now, we don't have any questions, but definitely hit us up, guys, if you have them.
Yeah, put them in the chat box. All right, well, I'll go back to sharing. All right, habitat diversity and connectivity. Community. So the thing with habitat diversity is that a habitat or an ecosystem or a biome are just different ways of describing communities of species. But what you really are talking about is a complex interdependent community, and it operates at all scales. There are global flows of energy and local flows of energy, and they are not independent. Human-created borders, whether between individual properties, towns, counties, or countries, affect the flow of energy and can have dramatic effects on species and habitat diversity. So habitat diversity is an important topic. And I just want to give an example of a long-range migrant. This is a migrant that appears as it bred in near Dolores Road this year, the Swainson's hawk. It's not that commonly seen, but it is seen. And I chose it because it's the longest migration of any birds at the Rio Fernando wetlands. Some of the birds as far as 6,000 miles. They spend the summer up in the plains of Canada and the US, and they winter down on the plains in the pampas of Cordoba and Buenos Aires states in Argentina. So what you're looking at is radio tag data from 44 different Swainson's hawks that were tagged between 19 and 95. They yielded these 4,515 separate locations. The green points are spring migration, the red points are fall migration. And the thing I think that's important to note here is these migrants travel through 15 countries, each with its own land use needs and differing levels of protection for migrating birds. The hawk's need for forested roosting sites and locations for feeding compete with local economic pressures, which often favor agriculture, monocropping, and urban development. You can come back and read some of this, but it's a very important topic. Just this last year, I contributed, as many people did, to the beginning of a new hawk monitoring site to complement the one that exists at Veracruz here and the one that exists in Panama. There's a new site in Colombia where the hawk, the Swainson's hawk, is known as the Aguililla Quaresmeña, as the Lenten season hawks. And it is hunted for food during the breeding season, during the migration. And it's believed to have special medicinal factions. So this Hawk Watch was started there to bring consciousness to that. So it's a huge problem. That and monocropping, urban development, all of those things are putting pressure. All of these. So the whole point here is just to get you thinking about monocropping, urban development, land use, because that's what comes about. That's what has the effects. Energy production and native plants. So the thing that underlies all of those communities, whether they are stretched out over thousands of miles or whether they are fairly compact, like the Rio Fernando wetlands, the source of energy comes in the form of photosynthesized plant material. Some birds use live materials, others use dead materials, but the energy from those materials gets circulated among the members of that community as they consume each other. And the result is that well, let me step in. Native plants, I say here, have a special role in each community because they share the same evolutionary history, and they've all been shaped by their relationship to each other. The shapes of the bird bills that are in a certain habitat have to do with the energy that's available in that habitat. And then the birds themselves spread seeds and keep the habitat going. It's a co-evolutionary situation. Just to bring home the solar powered food production, I want to briefly show something here. This graph is a graph showing the solar energy as it encounters the Earth's atmosphere. So here's the equator. Here's 90 degrees north. Here's 90 degrees. So I've turned it into a heat map. I adapted this from some other work, turned it into a heat map. So you see that in May, June, and July, and August, the energy in the northern hemisphere peaks. And in December, January, during the southern winter, the austral winter, the energy peaks in the southern part. So you see where the energy is. This is the peak area of the energy. What I've done here in the second graph is taken and plotted this data, these 4,515 points, plotted those data by latitude and date. So the date's running this way, latitude's going up and down here. And what we see is the Swainson's hawks staying in the high energy zone. And they're moving up. Their primary food in the winter is grasshoppers on the Pampas of Argentina. And their primary food in the north, they rely on grasshoppers and they rely heavily during migration, but during the breeding season, they also eat all kinds of small mammals and things. Any questions in the chat box here?
None at the moment.
Okay, is everybody awake?
Yes.
Okay, it's hard for me to tell because I can't see. Okay, all right, what have we got here? Well, what we have here is the Taos Valley. Oops, there we go. And here's the Rio Fernando watershed. And here is the Rio Fernando wetlands. And I say here the bird species that are not seen or rarely seen at Rio Fernando can be found at higher locations or locations higher up the watershed. And I just want to bring up the idea of beavers. Because when you start looking into watersheds, the idea of the presence of beavers becomes very important. Not only do they increase the amount of water available for plant production, because it's not cutting deep through the valley, they increase the biodiversity and they sequester carbon, particularly active dams, more so than other dams. And I say in reality, most of the land we live on and farm was to some extent created or shaped by beavers. And in some cases, that extent is a very large percentage. And then, of course, like most streams in northern New Mexico, there's all kinds of human land use, highways, roads, home and business development, septic system, fencing, noise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that can get in the way of the diversity and certainly in the ways of the beavers. But I would like to encourage you to follow this link to the New Mexico Beaver Summit, which was held last fall. These recordings of that 3-day summit, or maybe it's 4-day, I can't remember now, are on the Taos Land Trust site, and this is the link to them. And there's all kinds of practical methods that are developed now to address human beaver conflicts. So there are ways for us to coexist, and the more we can get creative with those ways, the stronger biodiversity, the stronger primary food production we have, the stronger habitat diversity, all of that is improved by that. So I say the mix of private and public lands in the array of city, county, state, and federal entities involved pose a set of challenges to conservation of the watershed. So I suggest 2 clear paths for action. Action you can take on your land, we'll talk about that in just a minute, and collaboration for everything else. So making your land yard bird friendly. Connectivity, we didn't talk so much about that, but if you go back here and you'll read, that is how energy flows between microhabitats or between habitats into the biome level or into the ecosystem level. And fragmentation is kind of the opposite of that. And it usually involves the destruction or the degradation of some part of the biota of the community. And it results in a loss of diversity and reproductive success. And I think an important thing to say, the way much land use is organized around individual private property plots easily lends itself to habitat fragmentation. On the other hand, you have a great deal of control within the confines of your own land or yard. So that's the approach first. The kinds of fences you erect, the choices between hardscape and vegetation, between monocropped lawns and diverse native plantings, all of these can affect the situation. And at a neighborhood scale, those effects are amplified. So this is something you can do and you and your neighbors can do. So plant production is at the base of habitat health and species diversity. It's useful to contemplate the extremes of a paved parking lot, that's one land use, with a diverse array of native plants. Now there's an interesting book. I have not read this book yet. I read about 50 pages of it. I read everything that I could on Amazon, look inside this book. And it's over in the post office. When I go to the mail tonight, I'll have it. But it's a very interesting book by a biologist who's written other books about backyard. And he's promoting the concept of the homegrown national park. And he's saying, all right, you don't have to wait on an entity to take action. You can take action yourself and do something. So there's a link here to a review of that book. You might want to check it out. I'm very excited to be reading more of it. And there's a couple of resources from Audubon on how to make your yard bird friendly, good places to start. And there's a search for native plants by zip code. Lots of things that individuals can do. And of course, we know that as we do that, then our neighbors notice, and then we go on and on. For many years on one of my fields, on about a 1/4 acre, I've grown bird seed, a mix of bird seed, and I have a wonderful array of migrants there in the fall. So the other approach, of course, is that an individual can take is to use the conservation easement on your private property. And of course, there's nobody that's in a better position to help you with that and to help you through the steps of that than the Taos Land Trust. So I've given a link there to their landowner's guide. And just one more quick item. There's a lot of organizations in Taos that are working on many of these issues. And here are links to many of them. There's the Land Trust, Amigos Bravos, Rivers and Birds, Field Institute of Taos, the Taos Valley Acequia Association. These people have a lot more in common than they have not in common, I would suggest. So I think that's what I have to say about that topic. So I would be happy to take questions on that, on those topics or any other topics about anything we've covered so far. And I'd like to hear if anybody has some birding experience that's a new thing in your own situation. I'd be happy to hear about that too.
Yep. Hit us up with questions. I could, if everybody promises not to shout at once, we could just unmute and have verbal questions.
Right, we can try that.
See how that works. Yeah, if you got a question, unmute yourself and throw it at us. Patsy? Oh, sorry. I thought you had a question.
No.
I just typed a question, but I can say it. I had trouble logging on to eBird. They kept asking me to create a login and that they would send me an email, but I never got the email. Then I wrote to them and they sent me all these instructions, but they didn't work.
Oh.
Anybody
well,
else have that problem? I don't know.
I don't know. Has anybody else had that difficulty?
I have not.
You know, Tara, is that your name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't you shoot me an email
Okay.
and why don't we get in phone contact and I'll help you through that.
Okay, great.
I'm
Thanks.
sure we can figure it out.
Tara, this is
Yeah.
Judy.
Hi.
I wanted to say that I had some trouble in the beginning too. But once I went back after a couple of days and tried it again, it did work.
Oh, did you have to re-enter a whole new login? Or did you use the one that you used before?
I tried to enter and they said, send another, there was a button for send another email and I did that.
Okay. I'll try it again.
Gene Case, how about you unmute and ask your question? You're still, let's see.
You're not unmuted, Gene.
Hate it when that happens. Am I live or is it memorized?
You're on now.
Okay. Yeah, Robert, I'm wondering, in the effort to increase some kind of a bird habitat, is it possible that one might also create a conflict with other species in that area? So in other words, you enrich for birds, perhaps at the expense of non-birds.
Well, I think the key to that is sticking to native plants. If you're sticking to native plantings, then you're probably going to enhance the community of birds. Now, the reality is that we live in places that have not necessarily been hosting native plants. So if you've been living in an agricultural area, which many of us do, you may have a different situation, and you may in fact temporarily have you're going to change the situation. I think the thing to understand is the bird is not separate from the habitat. Any change you make to the habitat is going to be a change to the bird. Whatever changes you make to the habitat create evolutionary pressures on that bird in terms of their own adaptation. So yes, it's going to change, and we've had, I mean, humans have created a massive movement of species all over the planet. I mean, all over the planet. I mean, one of the main construction materials in East Africa now, and for the last couple of 100 years, has been a plant that was brought there from Mexico. I can't think of the name of it now. Maybe somebody will. It's the poles that they use to make adobe type sisal. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing about climate change. All of that's changing. And again, I don't know where else to go but to suggest that species diversity is a good thing. And I'll give you another example. There's been long debates here about whether to clear Russian olive and salt cedar from the banks of the Rio Grande. There's been major efforts to clean it away, and there's been major efforts to not. Of course, many birds now have adapted to those. I've watched all kinds of birds. Lewis's woodpeckers, I watched for half an hour one day eating Russian olives. I've seen.
And excuse me, can I say something?
Sure,
This
Marilyn.
is Marilyn on the Rio Grande. I have watched wood ducks jumping up into the Russian olive and eating the seeds, berries, whatever they are.
Yeah. Now that doesn't mean that we should necessarily keep all those plants, but it does, I think, speak to the difficulty, Gene, that you were bringing up, is that we have a situation, and whatever you do changes that situation. The thing I think to do is to be conscious about it. Try to inform yourself. I mean, some of the things are easy. The extreme example I gave between an acre of concrete and an acre of plant material, that's easy. It gets a little harder then when you start thinking about, well, what plant material? And then you get in, well, do I want to have, how big do I want the lawn? Do I need a lawn? Or do I want native grasses? Or what do I want? So there's a lot of different issues, but these issues, in the irrigated acreages that we mostly live in, these issues were dealt with collectively. Before 1940s or so, the majority of housing was not in irrigated acreages. It was above the acequias. So that was a land use change that's been very dramatic. And so land use, it is such a difficult topic all over. But it's interesting. I mean, you don't have any choice but to start where you're at and try to be conscious about it and hope.
Robert, I have a
Robert,
question.
Robert, hold on 1 second there. I've got a bunch of questions coming up in the chat that I'd like to get to real quick, if you don't mind. They're all related to feeding birds.
Just a second, Bob, did you want to say something kind of on that other topic? Bob Kermsey?
No, actually, it's probably on the topic that you're just bringing up.
Okay, well then, all right, well.
I can come back to it.
Okay, yeah, give us
ahead.
1 second here.
Yeah.
Marilyn wants to know, she says she's been feeding Canada geese on the Rio Grande in order to push them downstream. How long should I continue this?
I'm feeding the Canada geese to bring them down from the county line where there's major duck and geese shooting every weekend. And now that's over as of the 1st of February. Duck hunting, goose hunting is over. But I feed them in December, January to kind of push them out of that area because it's really overkill up there. Okay,
Yeah.
now
Yeah,
what do I do?
that section, Maryland lives just down in the first section of irrigated land below the county line takeout. So that area, there's no road on the Rio Grande. And so hunters like to get back there and do illegal hunting. So even not even in season. The feeding of birds is a question that don't feed the bears, don't feed the mountain lions, don't feed this, don't feed that, don't feed the other, but feed the birds. It's a curious situation that we single out birds to feed. I think it's probably driven to a great extent by guilt because we know how much habitat we've taken from them. I'm not sure. It's also driven by who wouldn't want to be near them. Who hasn't had a close encounter with a bird, a personal close encounter with a bird where you saw eye to eye, you met eye to eye and communicated something on some nonverbal level that was unique and unforgettable. I mean, I totally understand what you're doing, Meryl. I don't know. Maybe somebody else has an idea.
Well, several people are asking, you know, what kind of bird seed is better? Like, is generic bird seed okay to put out for the birds if we don't have a homegrown bird garden? What are some recommended seed mixes for our areas? And where can we get bird seed to plant to grow bird habitat, bird-friendly habitat? And then my question is what's the bird feeding season? So all of that.
Certainly not in the breeding season is the bird feeding season, because that's it's a little more complicated in the breeding season because birds are defending territories. Data I've read suggests that even for hummingbirds, people think, oh, I'm out of food, they're going to die. They're getting about 10% of their food from human feeding. That's a number that I read someplace at some point in time. As for native plants, there is a link on the web tool to that site on Audubon. And if you put in your zip code, it says you need to put in your email. You don't have to put in your email. They're just trying to grab your email. You can just put in your zip code. It will give you a list with pictures of native plants in your area. There's also lots of books online, and there's that article that I linked to. As far as bird seed mixes, I would recommend talking to the people at the wild bird store in Santa Fe. They're very knowledgeable about what birds eat what food. And there is the key. What feed you put out changes what birds you'll get. If I put a standard mix out there with a lot of small seeds, I will suddenly have pigeons and Eurasian collared doves. If I put only sunflower seeds, I'll have all the nice birds that I want to see and not be bothered by those pesky pigeons and Eurasian collared doves. So kind of it gets down to that. The one thing that shocks people all the time is they put up the feeders, they're loving seeing their birds, and then suddenly a sharp-shinned hawk appears to attack one of their birds. And I've gotten calls saying, what can I do about these sharp-shinned hawks? There's a nest up here and it's, well, welcome to birds. Welcome to hunter-gatherers. It's war out there. You know, everything's got to eat. And, you know, that's what happens. It's, you know, it's, we have pulled ourselves out of that situation to a great extent. We no longer are going out hunting for the majority of our food. We're not in touch with being taken so much. It's pretty safe now to go out most places. We don't have to worry about being taken down by a mountain lion most of the time. You don't have to worry about being taken down a bear in most of our living situations. There are situations you can put yourself into where you do have to be worried about it, but it's not like it was when we were tribes of hunter-gatherers. It's a different situation.
Bob Kermsey, you had a question about food.
Yes, I think Robert may have already answered it. It has to do with, we live on a hill in Santa Fe that's very dry, west facing. And we've tried to plant some things that would attract hummingbirds, but it's been impossible. So we've been giving them hummingbird food, and we don't know if that's a good idea or if there's a time at the end of the season where you should stop so that they would they would migrate where they need to go. Are we keeping them from migrating by giving too much hummingbird food?
That's a good question, and that has been discussed. If you read birding magazines and such, you will see that discussion. I again go back to that idea that the feeders are not producing that much of the food for the birds. And I
Right.
suspect that's not the case. There have been these situations recently where there have been, maybe Jack, you can remember there was a species of hummingbird that overwintered in New York, I think over near the West Side Highway, up on the upper side there. I can't remember what hummingbird it was, but there were discussions then about, well, is the feeding the birds, you know, causing them to linger longer? I doubt it. A lot of the migration has to do with the photo length of the day, the time of the length of the day, and other cues. If you put migratory birds in cages, at the time that their migration normally starts, they will start flying against the side of the cage. They will start orienting themselves in the cage in the direction of migration. So there's other factors that are heavily at play. You know, if we feed the birds, we're also some number of those birds are going to die and go into the local food chain and feed the other predators, you know. So I don't know, it's a curious thing. And there are debates sometimes. And what I found is that lots of times people that are leading bird walks come down on the side of things like fishing not being a problem, and people that are not maybe come down on the other side. But fishing is where you go into a habitat and you go to try to bring a bird to step out. In the non-breeding season, it's not a big deal. And if you were the only birder that did it even during the breeding season in a certain location, it wouldn't be a big deal. But if you are one of 150 birders that are coming through a location in a week or in a day, and everybody's going up to the edge of the canopy and going, and you're a catbird and they're trying to defend your territory and feed your young, it's a bother because you have to go check out what is going on out here. Who is this? So it's disruptive to do that on in a heavily populated area or a heavily birded area. So there's all kinds of that. Here's what I would say about all of it. Anything you're doing about the birds, whether it's fishing, feeding, whatever you're doing, is almost like nothing compared to what humans are doing in terms of land use and habitat change, habitat degradation and such. One time, 10, 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to be sitting with the new national director of the Audubon Society. This was in Veracruz at a hawk watch. And I brought up the thing about, well, what about the Christmas bird count? What about the Christmas bird count's footprint, carbon footprint and all of that? And he said, well, I wouldn't want to discourage people from doing it. And I thought about that, and I went home, and I was in contact with Jeff LeBron, one of the administrators there, and I brought up the topic. He says, well, why don't you write an article about it? So I started looking into it. The first thing I did to look into it was that I did a study on the bird count in New Mexico. I could look at all the bird count data from New Mexico because I was a scheduler at that point in time for the bird counts. So I kind of knew, oh, that count down there, I see who all the list is. Okay, that was 3 cars from Albuquerque, went down to Socorro. Oh, that was 4 cars went over there to do that bird count. Anyway, I did that, and I did a rough calculation of the footprint of the New Mexico Christmas bird count. Then the whole footprint in terms of gasoline use, the carbon footprint in that terms of that, of emissions. Then I looked at Los Alamos Laboratory, and I found a website that listed all of the commuters and all of that situation. And so I did a calculation of that. And what I found out was,
it's 5 o'clock.
Oh, thank you. What I found out was that if you were to have everyone, and I'm not picking on Los Alamos here, it just was the one that I found that you could do. You could transpose this to state government or whatever. If everyone at Los Alamos was commuting 32 people to a vehicle, what the Christmas bird count over its 3-week period would equal 1 day of commuting at Los Alamos. So that kind of puts it in perspective. So the Christmas bird count in New Mexico is equal to 1 day of the commuting to Los Alamos if there were 32 people per vehicle, and there's not. So it's minuscule compared to then add in state government, add in Sandia Laboratory, add in the air bases, add in everything else. It's whatever birders are doing in feeding and counting and doing, it's minuscule compared to the other effects. Of course, in the end, I wrote back to the director and said, I sent him the spreadsheet, said, I'm not going to write an article. I don't want to discourage anybody from doing Christmas bird count. And that was that.
A couple other things. Someone brought up domestic cats and feral cats and their impacts on birds. We do know that cats kill billions of birds every year worldwide, and possibly millions each year in New Mexico. They have a significant impact on bird populations here. Robert, someone wanted to just clarify, did you say one shouldn't feed the birds during breeding season?
I didn't really mean to say that, but I'm just saying that their greatest, let me rethink that. I don't think I want to say either thing I was going to say. Whatever you're doing, feeding the birds, I think it's fine. Yeah. I was just thinking about the way in which habitats are defended and dealt with is a changed situation in the summer. But no, I wouldn't say that. No, I would say feed them.
One last question on this issue of land use, and then I think we need to wrap up. That someone asked you to speak to the value of juniper berries to birds. Many tree farmers, and I think this is true for other people with large areas of land, get the message to cut down juniper to reduce fuel danger, that could feed a catastrophic wildfire, and then ponderosa becomes somewhat monocropped. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, monocropping probably is never good for, it's not good for biodiversity. It's not good for nature in general. But humans are not just going to say, okay, we're done. It's, you know, we're leaving and goodbye, and that's that. Again, humans are the real issue here. Our land use is the real issue. And whatever we can do to change that land use so that it is more helpful to the nature that we all share, I think is positive. And I don't know if I could make a really coherent statement about this particular tree issue. But you don't get into issues like that until you get into monocropping. As soon as you get into monocropping on any scale, you introduce a new set of issues. So I think that probably is a set of issues. Bob Crimsey, you're a forester. Maybe you have a comment.
Well, you know, we actually had that question. You know, I led a program called Firewise in Lakeway, Texas, and one of the recommendations was to reduce it because it was such a fire hazard, but also in some places they were reducing it because they said it would make streams run again. I kind of doubted that, but I'm not as familiar with the juniper species here in New Mexico yet.
All right, guys, I think we need to wrap it up. We're past 5, and thank you all for joining us. I'll have this posted on our website by the end of the week. Thank you very much to Robert for putting this all together and hosting this, and
You're welcome.
all the great answers.
Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun.
Right.
All right, and for those of you who are interested in continuing on with our work, we'll be in touch in March.
Yes, yeah, and send me your email if you want to be on my Taos or Dixon birders list. And we'll go out. Sooner or later, we're all going to go birding.
We're going to be able to soon.
Talking about birds on Zoom is okay, but actually going out there and looking through the binoculars and listening through the ears is better. So,
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
bye.